A tall, beautiful model strides confidently across our TV screens, assuring us that coal is our friend, providing both abundant energy and economically important jobs for Americans. Now, is she trying to persuade us to rush down to the mall and buy ourselves a bag of coal? No, but the apparent motivation for such campaign advertisements is not always the only one. Clean coal, which is different from regular coal because you say clean first, is a myth that the coal industry wants to sell the voting public so that environmental concerns about the impact of coal on our water, our air, and on global temperatures will not interfere with their profits. But more than that, buying advertisement from corporate media is a way of protecting a vulnerable industry from unfavorable news coverage. In the same way that hospitals run PR campaigns advertising the services of their physicians or their cancer group or whatever, as if any of us have much of a choice. Your insurance has certain providers. You're going to go to the one that you can see, but they advertise because the purchase of advertisement helps to ensure the hospital industry from investigative reporting. In some instances, where the disaster is bigger than mere bribes can manage, governments have been known to step in to silence the media rather than depending upon the uncertainty of trying to simply buy influence. More than a year after the damaged reactor at Fukushima, Japan began leaking radiation into the adjoining ocean, the government passed a law preventing any media from mentioning radiation at Fukushima. The law carries a potential 10-year prison sentence for any journalist who actually does the only thing that we need journalists to do, which is to give us important information. It is understandable that the government has an interest in avoiding public panic, but repressing important and possibly life-saving information is shameful at best, and more likely, it's a kind of governmental malfeasance. Similarly, in North Carolina and Virginia, state legislators have refused to fund research into anything that even uses the words global warming or rising sea levels. They are refusing to address the science related to what is actually happening to their shores so that they could prevent human carnage and destruction of property. After Hurricane Sandy, the largest and most devastating storm in America's history, hit New Jersey, that state's Republican governor, Chris Christie, began to show a great deal more respect for what is the more fact-based conversation about human dependence on fossil fuels that is pushing our planet towards a dangerous tipping point of climate disaster. One of the ways in which now Christie is being called a liberal, not just for shaking hands with the President of the United States, but because he's actually discussing the real and concerning threat of environmental changes. Now, major world religions have had a hard time getting a handle on the topic of environmental ethics. There are a number of important explanations for our past failure, but all of those explanations must be seen as barriers that we must overcome. First, Western religions, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, have been very text-oriented. All three of those major Western religions have sought to derive their authority from scriptures, but scriptures, all of which were written at a time when the balance of power between the earth and humans was decidedly on the side of nature. While we find examples of cherishing life, discovering awe in nature, and declarations that certain rivers or places were uniquely holy, there's much more in all of those world religions' scriptures about domination and fear of nature. All of our ancient scriptures assume that nature has power and we do not. Progressives have to get past our devotion to ancient religious literature as our only source of information. We do not, for example, have to find a way to interpret the Genesis creation story to create a sense of environmental urgency, nor do we have to play fast and loose with truth claims about either Native American or Druid spirituality to insist that we will find substantive direction from these or any other ancient sources. The motivation for trying to make Genesis demand that we as religious people care for the planet at one level is a laudable goal, but doing so requires that we abandon our efforts at moving away from supernatural theism and the assumption that God somehow wrote the Bible. You can certainly find examples of a more respectful approach to creation in some other primitive religious sources, but I got to tell you, you can also find contradictions. And if you depend on ancient sources, you're just creating a debate about something that, folks, think about it. This is no longer debatable. Whether we should save the planet or not is not a serious question. We don't have to look at ancient scriptures to find direction for that. We've got scientific data from the present moment. The modern world is in crisis, and not a crisis that was foreseen by ancient prophets or written down in ancient texts. Now is a time when we have to apply our religious devotion to ethics and to the truth, to join together a moral will of the faith community with environmental scientists to do the right thing. Secondly, we have at times associated our religion with too specific sites like rivers or holy lands. Poets, I think, often express urgent truths better than our holy scriptures do. I love the line in Michael Franti's song, Hello Bonjour, where the poet boldly states that every drop of water is holy water and every piece of land is holy land. Again, the Jewish claim of a promised land, the Christian identity with certain holy sites, the Hindu attribution of holy status to one of their rivers, the Muslim devotion to Mecca and other traditional sites where they believe that something important happened, that there's nothing more holy about Jerusalem than there is Lexington, Kentucky, or about Mecca than there is in Belize City. The Florida swamp that appears to be commercially of no value is a part of the same earth that is the Grand Canyon or the Alps. Our reverence of one body of water should not be determined by tradition or what we believe may have happened there in antiquity in our faith history, but that we are all a part of the earth, and all parts of the earth are connected to one another. The cleanness, the sacredness of one river is just as much as the next. Finally, there's been way too much emphasis placed on belief in an afterlife that can devalue the only world we actually know exists and whose existence we can now kill. Even for those who feel the need to hold on to a belief in afterlife, and you certainly have a right to do that. There's no evidence either way. I would still offer the corrective of Soren Kierkegaard, who cautioned that there are things that are true when they are whispered, that become false when they are shouted. Belief in heaven may bring comfort to the dying and solace to the grieving, but this belief has been used to dismiss efforts at saving this world because, as some legislators have asserted, God is in charge of the world and nothing will happen to it without God's will. From my perspective, the spiritual passion to protect our planet is also threefold. The first is simply a reverence and awe for creation in all of its wonder and beauty and complexity. Henry David Thoreau was not the first to find more of the divine in nature than in church, and he certainly won't be the last. One should not exclude the other, but they should certainly be partners in inspiring and educating the spirit of both. As someone who's had to lead outdoor services, I can tell you no sermon has ever been written that is as interesting as looking at nature. That's why we make you all sit in a room with colored windows or covered windows. I cannot hold your attention if you have the opportunity to look at anything else. Secondly, environmental issues have a huge social justice concern. Many of the major sources of pollution are profit-driven industries that are making a choice of short-term profits over long-term environmental health. Also, the poor of every nation generally wind up living in the areas where these industries dispose of their harmful waste. The resources of the earth should not be the sole possession of those who have manipulated governments and banking interests into giving them exploitative rights that are, in any rational analysis, not the right of any narrowly defined corporate interest or individual ownership. We innately understand that the air belongs to all of us, but it would be helpful if we could maintain some of the sense of that global connection when it comes to real estate. As we saw in the 2004 tsunami in Southeast Asia, where the rising sea level and strong storm surges sent a wall of water onto shore, in most countries, it is the poor who are living on the shoreline. It is the poor that live in fishermen's shacks and in the runoff tenements on the shore of most countries. They're the ones in poorly constructed homes. They're the ones that die first when the storm surges come. And finally, I believe this is a matter of compassion for future generations. The present generation that stands on the face of the earth does not have the right to use up the earth that will shortly be inherited by another generation. We talk about owning land as a part of our economic and personal safety interest, but how really can any mortal own something that lasts forever? We are stewards of the land, and as stewards, we have a much more vital interest that trumps our desire for personal profit. If we destroy any natural resource in this generation, we are robbing the generations that come after us. That should go without being said. What could be more obvious than the fact that we are obligated to leave behind a planet that can be successfully inhabited by future generations? And yet, folks, sometimes the most obvious truths are the ones that the faith community is obligated to repeat the loudest and the most obvious, because they're not getting it anywhere else. It would not be difficult to become exhausted with the virtual panic in the voices of most environmental advocates. However, we should not fail to note that when we have become convinced that that is what needs to be done, we have been able to forestall planetary devastation. We've been able in the past to restore forests, to clean up rivers and lakes. We even, through individual efforts, as well as changes in government policies, reversed the erosion of the ozone layer, even though no one goes camping in the ozone layer or posts vacation pictures from there on their Facebook page. People can, when given the correct information and the reason to act on it, stop poisoning their own habitat. Environmentalists, unfortunately, often look a lot more like Michael Moore than they do the lady who keeps telling us that we should have more coal in our breakfast cereal because mercury poisoning really isn't all that bad. But we have to choose to not be gullible. These advertising campaigns are slick, they're attractive, they make us want to believe them, but they are not telling us the truth. We cannot be gullible about this, and we must not be fatalistic about saying that we have to pollute the earth in order to maintain our standard of living. Understanding how to care for the earth is complicated. It takes an investment of energy, and at many junctures, it will require some personal sacrifice. We will have to give up some aspects of the way that we live in order to protect the planet. The largest consumption of fossil fuels is expended in two areas. The first is in the heating and cooling of our homes. The second is in transportation. And those two places are where we have to concentrate our efforts. It would be wonderful if we were all motivated to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. However, human nature being what human nature is, doing the right thing is always easier if it actually saves us some money at the same time. Strengthening our conscience and protecting our financial resources are not always mutually exclusive. That's part of the research that we were doing with Dr. Pawlowski's team in Jamaica, is trying to find ways to get the resorts that actually have a negative economic impact or environmental impact to contribute money to the nature preserves, the fish sanctuaries, the bird sanctuaries, so that there is a healthier relationship that keeps places like Jamaica attractive to tourists, good for sandals, but also protects the environment, that's good for the environment. Learning to recycle, to refrain from using disposable items. And one of the things we noted when we went out to the beach areas where we were doing some of our site research is that there's nothing but a line of plastic bottles washed up everywhere. Do you remember 20 years ago we thought people were silly for paying $1 for a bottle of water, and then we all started doing it. We all carried bottles of water, and those bottles don't disintegrate very fast. The world is filling up with plastic bottles. Even many of the marine life that when they are found dead on the beach and cut open, we find that their stomachs are full of plastic products. We have got to move away from these disposable items that, even though we may have the best of intentions, they oftentimes end up in the absolute wrong places. We can make choices about being cautious about the use of energy and the kinds of appliances that we buy, the lights, the television, as well as heating and cooling. All of these efforts can lower our bills while acting to save our planet. You know, for a couple of seconds that's understandable, but if it keeps going off, then it starts to look like, I don't know, I don't feel undermined. I don't feel undermined or anything. But investing in energy-efficient light bulbs, water heaters, and appliances have upfront costs, but they promise long-term savings. Transportation is the larger and more complex issue. Larger, more powerful vehicles are attractive to us. The sale of SUVs jumped after 9/11, that somehow it was in people's minds that if they just had a bigger car, the terrorists couldn't get at us. SUVs used to be sold to people that needed to take hay up to the livestock that were on top of the mountain that was covered with snow. Now we have to have a giant SUV to go to Sam's? Really? These choices are choices that you know, it is more comfortable to drive down the road in a car the size of your living room, and it's better in snow for sure, which evidently you all have experienced some of. Don't hate me. Don't hate me. However, choosing smaller, hybrid, or alternative energy transportation is an option for most of us, and it's something we can do proactively to help conserve limited resources and to cut back on pollution. Still, a huge percentage of the consumption of gasoline in major cities, and I've heard numbers as high as 40% of the gasoline burned in major cities is burned by people who are looking for a parking place. All of us have experienced sitting for long periods of time in traffic jams where there are rows and rows of cars stopped in multiple lanes as far as the eye can see, and all of them are just sitting there burning fossil fuels, just sitting there. The creation of energy-efficient mass transit would require a sea change of priorities for nations such as ours. We're not only accustomed to private transportation, but our economy is deeply invested in the manufacture, sales, and maintenance of automobiles and all of the accompanying industries of road construction, sale of gasoline, car mechanics, parking lots. Both government and private corporate interests will continue to use their influence to keep Americans in cars until we insist that they do differently. Mass transit would cut down on pollution, cut down on the consumption of fossil fuels. It would deeply cut down on traffic accidents in which we're losing upwards of 40,000 people a year some years. It would cut down on the amount of land needed for parking, personally owned garage space, and the time that it takes to get from one place to another. There certainly would be a huge upfront investment to build this kind of infrastructure, but isn't that a small consideration compared to what not going towards mass transit is doing to us economically and doing to our planet? The technology exists. Other nations are taking great strides in this direction. I mean, is it really that the Germans and the French and the Japanese and the Chinese are that much smarter than us? Or do they just see the way that the future requires that we go? All that stands between us and making huge progress in protecting both our environment and our personal incomes and the economy of the United States is for us to collectively have the will to change. The most important task of the ancient prophets and of the early church and of any meaningful incarnation of the church in the future, our job is to speak the truth to power. Our news media is almost exclusively corporate-owned and profit-driven. Even our public media, our NPR and public television, is influenced by government grants and corporate sponsorship. NPR's coverage of the coal industry almost looks like the coal industry is paying NPR to do the coverage. The church, then, must maintain its independence from profit-driven interest and even find the courage to be faithful to the truth in the face of shifting public opinion. Pastors are not environmental experts, but we sure do need to expose ourselves to the research and insights of the people who are environmental experts. We need to articulate a passionate, informed, and prophetic message to the public that may not really want to hear it, that may not want to know how imperative our ecological concerns have become. One of my favorite old hymns, Once to Every Man and Nation, says that the truth is forever on the scaffold and wrong is forever on the throne, but it's the scaffold that sways the future. I fear that too much of the mainstream church is cowering in a self-defensive posture, trying to hold on to its meager existence for just one more generation. What I'm trying to say to you about the church and environmental activism is what William Shedd meant when he said that a ship in harbor is safe, but that's not what we build ships for. The church exists for telling the truth and giving the crisis that is at hand in the environment its past time for us to stop being afraid of the consequences of being prophetic, because the consequences of being silent are surely much worse.
Amen.
You've been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at reverenddray@aol.com for more information.